Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very glad to be joined today by one of our authors, Marjorie Corbman, who is the author of this book, Divine Rage, Malcolm X's Challenge to Christians. This book was actually published a couple of years ago, and we missed this opportunity then, but it seemed like a very opportune time to talk about it now because this is actually the centenary of Malcolm X's birth, 1925. He died 60 years ago, 1965. And there's no doubt that following his death, his life and influence entered into many cultural, political, and and spiritual or Christian theological channels, and that's a lot of what the book is about. How somebody who was most of his life as a prominent militant minister in the Nation of Islam, who then, after his break with his mentor Elijah Muhammad, became an Orthodox Sunni Muslim, and yet the influence that he had at a time when the kind of mood in the civil rights movement was kind of shifting from the kind of Gandhian nonviolence to a more militant mantra or slogan of Black Power, and how that posed a challenge to many Christians to think about how to reconcile that idea of Black Power with the gospel. In a way, the book is about these kind of different moments over the last 60 more years, in which Malcolm X's influence or significance has kind of ebbed and flowed like the tides, or as a pendulum, as you said. And we were, just before we started, we were talking a little bit about the fact that it was surprising that the centenary of uh, Malcolm X's birth didn't seem to generate as much attention or commemoration as you would have thought. Compared to other moments, like when Spike Lee's movie came out and it was a black, Malcolm X moment, and then 5 years ago during the Black Lives Matter at the peak of those protests. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Um, why maybe you could just give a little sketch of who Malcolm X was and the basis of his kind of cultural, political, and religious influence.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm really yeah, excited to be able to talk about this book and just I think that it was really a privilege to be able to um this is kind of a cheesy way to put it, but really to befriend Malcolm over the course of the time that I did the research that initially was for my PhD dissertation at Fordham, and then became the book research. And I think something that I think I cherished the most from that time was that since I was doing my PhD in New York, I was able to go to the Schomburg Center for Black Research and Culture, where they keep Malcolm X's personal letters, and to be able to get to know him as a person, and not only through the lens of the autobiography, which I think, like for me and for most people, is the first way that they get to know Malcolm is through the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is by Alex Haley, sort of Malcolm X. But to be able to get this kind of unfiltered, messy, complicated view into this person who really, what really came out to me more strongly than anything from just being able to look through those letters, and to get to know him that way, in addition to all the other research that I did, um, was what a genuine seeker he was, and also what a genuinely religious person he was. That was something that was really stressed by a lot of people who knew him, and it's something that is not stressed a lot by people who write about him for the most part. There's exceptions to that. Um, but he was someone who just really had a genuine encounter with the divine when he was in prison, which I'll get to the context a little bit of that. But and I think the rest of his life, really from 1948 on, which is when he was first imprisoned and had this encounter with the divine. The rest of his life up until when he was assassinated in 1965 was a way of figuring out what that meant. And that looked very different at different times. But he really I really just see him as someone who genuinely sought after God and genuinely sought after the truth. And for him, that was so bound up in fighting for the freedom of his people, and for seeing God in the world through the story of his people. Um, but I mean, I think the short version, which I think is really familiar for everyone, is he's someone who um, is born in the Midwest, kind of West Midwest, and then uh, eventually comes out to the East Coast. His family is he comes from a family of Black nationalists. His parents were part of the Garveyite movement, which in and of itself was like a really associated with like back to Africa sentiments, with Black empowerment, and also with the idea of God as in some ways uniquely associated with Black people. So he had um, these theological ideas in his childhood before he developed them later as an adult. Um, his parents, there's, as people know from the autobiography, his father was tragically murdered. His mother ends up really kind of losing her mind over the course of some time after that. The children are taken away by social services from his mother, um, and eventually they go out to live with his sister in Boston. Malcolm then gets involved in a lot of sort of petty crime and eventually is incarcerated. He describes himself in the autobiography, and a lot of the ways that he portrayed himself at that point as really like almost demonic. Like he had lost a sense of self. He had lost a sense um, of meaning in life and also had lost a connection to God. But then when he was in prison, his family actually became involved in the Nation of Islam before he did, and they started preaching to him about it. And then he had this really powerful encounter that he writes about in the autobiography with this figure of God as a non-white person. I'm saying non-white and not Black because he describes him as someone of he can't actually place his race, but he knows it's a dark-skinned person who sits by his bed, and uh, there's not really a lot of description given of that encounter, but he sees God in that face of this non-white person. Um, and after he gets out of prison, becomes a leader in the Nation of Islam, which was a Black nationalist religious movement founded by this mysterious figure named W.D. Farad, but then really taken leadership of by Elijah Muhammad. Um, and Malcolm becomes the most famous representative of that movement up until he leaves it. Well, he's really forced out of it at the very end of 1963, going into 1964, due to growing disputes between him and Elijah Muhammad. And in the meantime of all of this, becomes this nationally known figure, internationally known figure, this voice of Black anger, of Black empowerment. Even the fact that I'm using the word Black is something that actually was associated with Malcolm and his movement, and not with other civil rights groups who at the time would have used different terms. That he was really reclaiming that of just actually he's really the forefather of the Black is Beautiful movement in that way, that he's saying um, there is something empowering and beautiful about, and we should own who we are as Black people. Um, and is enormously influential on the civil rights movement and pushing it into a more uh, confrontational but also empowering direction, more focused on self-defense, more focused on community building, and then after his break with Elijah Muhammad, more on using international institutions like the United Nations to condemn the United States and its racism. And then he is assassinated in February of 1965.
Mm. The there are parallels with the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. With Steve Biko there again too, with that idea that uh, Black people and the majority in their country had their consciousness was colonized. They were forced to see themselves through the eyes of white people, and they were really also heirs of Malcolm, I guess. That idea of Black pride, Black Power as a big term arose, which was a kind of reclaiming of dignity and pride and authenticity that was not determined by an oppressive white culture as the first kind of step of on the road to liberation.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most powerful things that I found when I was doing the research for the book, the phrase that really stuck with me that speaks to what you're saying, um, was from Sonia Sanchez, who's one of the founders of the Black Arts Movement, who's
Mhm.
deeply, deeply influenced by both the Nation and Malcolm. And she has this line, which I quote in the book, of, "Can you imagine living your entire life and never once having loved yourself?" And
Mm.
saying that Malcolm was the one who taught her and so many others how to love themselves as Black
Mm.
people.
Mm. I'm sort of interested that, of course, Malcolm and Martin Luther King are operating simultaneously, uh, and reaching somewhat different audiences, somewhat different messages. But yeah, you don't refer very much to the relationship between them, which maybe you didn't want to repeat what James Cone did in his book Martin and Malcolm, but there's that kind of question that Cone raises, or that maybe the two of them, they're often seen as polar opposites in the kind of trajectory, the movement of their lives, were moving in a much more convergent way. Uh, you think
Yeah.
that's right?
I think that is right. I think that, and first of all, I think that like both of them, Malcolm and Martin, kind of stand in for symbols of the kinds of political and religious sentiments that they come out of. Like they come out of different movements in Black history and Black religion. Um, Martin, obviously coming out of the more institutional Black church, himself being a Baptist minister, um, and having been, uh, he got his PhD at BU. He, was sort of more um, like coming out of Christian systematic theology at the same time that he was coming out of this deep Black church tradition. And then was deeply influenced by Christian Gandhians like by Rustin and others who really, from their account, really taught Martin everything he knew. And I think that's
Mhm.
probably right. He was really open to their ideas, but then became the symbol of those ideas that were much broader than just him. And then Malcolm coming out of this more what I refer to using a term by some sociologists who've used this term of Black messianic nationalism,
Mhm.
which is more something that is associated with northern storefront churches more
Mhm.
than anything else, right? Like coming out of the Great Migration, which happens at the start of the 20th century, when many like millions of Black people come up to the cities of the North, found their own communities,
Mhm.
and they take on their own characteristics, some of which are really religiously hybrid or, uh, to use William David Hart's term, Afrocentric. Like
Mhm.
they're not they don't fit that standard narrative of Black religion, which is what Hart calls it. Um, and are often associated with with this kind of like really apocalyptic preaching, uh, this sort of sense of the right the this particular religious identity of Black people being like the chosen people, having like a messianic identity
Mhm.
almost. And so he really does. That's what the Nation of Islam comes out of, and so that's really the school in which Malcolm was taught. So I think those two, when we talk about the difference between Martin and Malcolm, what we're really talking about is the difference of those two streams in Black thought and Black religious thought, which is something that I think I really wanted to show in the book, is that both of them are coming out of these rich traditions that have their own legacies and have their own effects upon the movements that they're part of. But as people, they're much more complicated than that. And I completely agree with Cone that as people, they don't always fit into those categories that we put them into. Um, there's so many instances you can find, especially towards the end of Malcolm's life, of him saying things or doing things that don't fit that model, or like agreeing with things that you would think that Martin would agree with, and vice versa. I mean, and Cohn makes the point in his book Martin and Malcolm that by 1968, Martin's preaching sounds a lot like Malcolm's. He's talking about, God's going to strike down Babylon, and he means the United States, right? So, like, he's using this language that we associate more with Malcolm. And then we hear about Malcolm like meeting with white college students in Oxford and, really, really enjoying conversations with them and just like learning from them. So, it really, as people, they're much more complicated, but the traditions they come out of are distinct.
Well, did Malcolm really actually have a lot to say about Christianity directly? A critique or his attitude toward the church or Christians in general, black Christians.
Yeah, it's complicated. So he did and he didn't, right? So I mean, especially as a minister of the nation, and they used the term minister in the Nation of Islam at the time. Um, so which is most, I mean, we forget because we associate so much of Malcolm with the autobiography, which really focuses on that turning point that happened in really 1964, which is when he really developed the persona that we associate with Malcolm X, separate from the Nation of Islam. But we
Mhm.
forget that like most of his, ministry, most of his career, most of the time he was in the public space, like the vast majority of that time, he was a minister of the Nation of Islam. Um, and the Nation of Islam had a very clear critique of Christianity, a very strong critique. It was seen as a slave religion. Um, and it was seen as, a lot of nation uh, temples at the time, later called mosques, would have like an image of a lynched person that would be
Mhm.
there with the cross, and it would say Christianity equals slavery, suffering, death.
Mhm.
That really kind of sums up the message of what Christianity represents. It's the religion of um, basically just controlling the the African American community according to the teaching of the
Mhm.
nation. But it's also more complicated than that, and it was more complicated for Malcolm because so much of the preaching and the doctrine and just like the culture of the Nation of Islam also comes out of the Black biblical tradition of interpretation of the Bible, of and even actually, one thing I noted in some of the letters that Malcolm wrote, he would talk about the spirituals, which is actually something that's different than Elijah Muhammad. But in personal letters that he wrote, he would say like the Black people songs, because Black people are holy, which is something that was associated with the Nation of Islam. Black people's songs are holy. That's why we sing the spirituals. We're a spiritual people. And he wrote that in one of his early personal letters after converting to the Nation of Islam. But the spirituals, of course, were produced in a Black Christian context, right? So it is a little bit more complicated than just that. But yeah, the general critique was that Christianity basically is a religion of control. It's meant to make you um, feel okay about your suffering and make it so that you're not going to rise up. You're not going to defend yourself. You're going to just be weak and sort of take the oppression that the slave master is giving to you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about one of the people that is important in your book and important to Orbis Books, James Cone, who is the one who most systematically draws on Malcolm as a resource in developing his own uh, Black liberation theology. And you say that Cone himself and other critics often say that he took from Malcolm the kind of cultural and political message and combined that with I, I wouldn't have even said Martin Luther King so much, but as you sort of suggest, his roots in Bearden and growing up in the church. But yeah, but you also show that there are kind of theological or religious kind of impulses in Malcolm that Cone draws on.
Yeah, exactly. So and it's interesting because I had the great privilege of studying with Cohn when I was in New York. I took a course at Union, and it was the best possible course to take with James Cohn because it was on James Baldwin. Um,
Mhm.
and so much of actually the what he taught, how he taught James Baldwin was to see Baldwin as kind of like the best of both worlds. You get the best of Martin, the best of Malcolm, and in Baldwin. Um, and this was this was a couple years before he passed away. Um, and in some ways it's a shame because I was able to tell him before he passed that I was going to do my dissertation on him and Malcolm and other figures in that orbit. Um, but I really wish that I would have been able to continue that conversation and ask him specifically, like, why do you say this? Because I can see that you're drawing from Malcolm. I can see that theologically you're drawing from Malcolm. So why is it that you portray it as if what you're taking from Malcolm is a political stance rather than a theological one? But I never got the chance to ask him that question.
Well, explain what that means.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the main thing that's really important is that really the key theological instinct and the key theological principle of the Black messianic nationalism of the Nation of Islam and of Malcolm is going back to that initial experience with the divine that Malcolm had in that prison cell is God is Black,
Hmm.
right? So that God is present in Black people. God, if we want to look at God in the world, if we want to find where God is in the world, we should look at Black people and specifically Black people really fighting for their freedom. And so that's something that is deeply embedded in the doctrine of the nation. It's deeply embedded in Malcolm's initial encounters with, Marcus Garvey as a child, that whole long tradition of Black religious nationalism. Um, and that's something that Malcolm himself talks about. And as we know, that is really a key insight of that's what James Cone is known for in his early work, especially, right? In Black theology and Black power and Black theology of liberation. This uh, the theolo that he makes a theological argument using Christian systematic theology, um, especially at the time he's using. I mean, it's such a bold project we forget because we're so used to it at this time. But the fact that the main thing he's doing in his early work is taking the theology of Karl Barth and using the theology of Karl Barth to argue that God is Black.
Yeah.
Um, and it works, right? He makes an argument saying like if God identifies God's self with, the least of these in the world, who are the least of these in the world right now? It's in America, it's Black people, and therefore we can make a theological statement that is in some ways a literal statement that God is Black.
Mhm.
Um, and he goes really actually even further than that in his early work, where he then makes the corresponding statement that if God is Black, then the demonic is white. When we're talking about Satan, when we're talking about demons, when we're talking about possession, what we're talking about is whiteness. And he makes some really strong statements about that in his early work, and he explicitly cites Malcolm X. He says, like Malcolm X says, maybe the closest thing we can like what that we can say when we're talking about demonic possession uh, is whiteness.
He's
I don't have the exact word.
channeling the Nation of Islam there. And
Yeah, exactly. Which was one of the things that most to this day, right? It's the thing that like most is like the uh, that most bothers people about. I mean, understandably, but yeah, that most is like the most like offensive thing that comes out of the nation's doctrine is the sense of that the devil is the white man,
yeah.
right? But it's also like such an invigorating thing. And so a lot of what I was trying to show is not only for Cone, but for so many figures um, during this time, uh, being able to say God is Black and the devil is white was just this explosion of theological creativity. And that's what
So
Cone
even though both Malcolm and Cone evolved kind of beyond that kind of
yes.
stark polarity.
Yeah, right. And I think like, I think there's a connecting figure here too that I talk a lot about, which is Albert Clegg.
Mhm.
Um, and he, I think he's really clear in his writing. So, oh, actually, I should say just a little bit about Albert Clegg because he's an important figure in the book. So he's um, a Detroit-based pastor who was really, really involved in local community organizing on many different fronts. And he is like completely won over by Malcolm. And so during the Detroit riots of 1967, he like completely, sort of rebrands his church to being a Black nationalist church. and kind of patterns it after the Nation of Islam, but is in an explicitly Christian way, and in which Jesus is the Black Messiah. And so he takes sort of this tradition we're talking about, this theology of God is black, the devil is white, and he puts it in a Christian context. And we know for a fact because uh, James Cone was nearby. He was it, only it was a short drive away. He was in Michigan, um, and we know that Cone did visit Clegg's church on a number of occasions, um, and learned from this approach that Clegg was taking. Um, and but Clegg is really clear in his writings that he knows it's a mythological language, and he's really, I think, very self-aware of the fact that he doesn't think this is literally true. He doesn't think it's literally true that white people are the devil.
Mm.
But there's something that he thinks is able to like break the psychological chains of needing to get white approval, of needing to um, get just to sort of base one's own psychological and spiritual life on whiteness. By being able to say that, it sets you free, and then you can develop your own kind of spiritual community with other uh, people of color. Um, so, and I think that that's how it works for both Malcolm and Cone in different ways too, even though they wouldn't put it exactly that way. But yes, they do then grapple with it and evolve and change, and none of them stay where they started with that
Mm.
theology.
One thing I found interesting in Clegg that he points out that this kind of a theme of divine rage or wrath of God is has a long lineage in American history,
Yeah.
and his reflections on the battle hymn of the Republic, all about God's judgment and wrath, which he says white people have totally forgotten, don't
Yeah,
recognize.
no, it's like it's kind of a fun. He does kind of like it's sort of a funny sermon, right? And it's
Yeah,
given
right.
during the riots where he's just reading the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which initially was written during the Civil War, um, and he's relating it to the context of the Detroit Rebellion, and he's
Mhm.
saying like he'll like read a line and he's like, oh, I don't think they're going to be singing this anymore. Like he just every time he reads it because it's just like, ooh, yeah, they're not going to like this anymore.
Well, we don't have time to talk about all the figures that so many interesting figures in here. Vincent Harding and Julius Lester, who is somebody I remember being very interested in, a black revolutionary who then goes to North Vietnam and Cuba and everything. And he then gets all interested in Merton and spirituality and ends up becoming a Jew, uh, and that kind of trajectory. And then you talk about, of course, Thomas Merton, who wrote about very admiringly about Malcolm X. And then there's the interesting things about how even the Black Panthers read Merton and found things compelling, not just about his writing about the ghetto, but about spirituality and mysticism and that sort of thing. And then you get into the Black arts movement and poets and artists and the Puerto Rican young lords and queer uprisings, and all these different ways that Malcolm kind of manifests himself. And so maybe with just a few minutes we have left, to think about where you see his uh, kind of brand present today. We talked a little bit about, and you end the book kind of in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests, which have, a lot of overtones of Malcolm. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's interesting, as you're listing all of those figures that I wrote about and the different ways they were influenced by Malcolm and really wrestled with him in different ways and ended up in different spaces with that. I think I think there's two things. I think one is the brand, right? So, and I think there is something of like, I was saying this before about sort of there's the idea of the person and then there's the person with both Martin and Malcolm. So I
Mhm.
think there's the idea of the person of Malcolm and the symbol that's there for Malcolm is always going to be that kind of that fire, that rage. And um I do think, I mean, obviously that, that is something that was very present in 2020, and which is why I wanted to end on the with that coda of looking at uh, the presence of Malcolm X, specifically in the uprisings of 2020, and how people were talking about Malcolm, how people were continuing to relate to his legacy. And it's always going to be in this sense of like, do we have a right to be angry? Do we have a right to um, stand up for ourselves? And then what does that mean in terms of our community, our spirituality? Where is God in that? It's this other way of talking about where God is in social movements than the one we associate more with Martin. Um, I do think you're right, as you mentioned before the call started, and at the start of this call, that it seems that we're not quite in that space as much as we were in 2020 right now. There's been a lot of backlash on all of the forward movement that was made during that time, and I think people are maybe at large now not as interested in drawing upon that tradition. Um, but I also think that in some ways, at least in a lot of circles on the left, I think we're still in that space of um, like reclaiming that language of uh, of anger, of using this kind of like oppressor oppressed dynamic to talk about power. But to do, I think there are definitely a lot of religious communities now still trying to say, well, how do we do that in a way that's consistent with our religious tradition? So all of that is the brand, I would say. But then I think there's the person, especially all those figures you were rattling off there, because you're right, there was a lot. I put a lot in what's not a very long book, but there's a lot of I put a lot of figures into it. But what so drew me to all those figures is how much I think they were really more in the tradition of Malcolm as a person, which again, just going back to what I said at the beginning, is he's a seeker. And
Yeah.
I think that he just genuinely sought after God. He genuinely sought after truth. He was more interested in that than any idea. Um, and all of those people were willing to face like, what if what I'm saying isn't true? Or
Mhm.
what if actually this is causing more harm than good? And maybe I need to switch
Mhm.
gears a little bit. And they really felt it so deeply. I see Malcolm as someone who really felt things really, really deeply. Um, and I think that for me, I think the sort of legacy that I'm most interested in for Malcolm um, is that ongoing
Mhm.
grappling with these questions of really looking at the world that we're in right now, looking at all of the pain and the oppression and
Mhm.
the uh, just the disarray that we're in societally right now, and to be able to look at that and to feel the pain of it and to really genuinely want to say, where is God in all of this? With all of the emotions I'm feeling about it, including anger, including pain, including compassion. Um, what is my calling, and how do I respond to it? And so I see all of those figures as really within that tradition. Um,
Marjorie, we're into our last seconds here.
yes, go for it.
So I just want to thank you very much. I really enjoyed this book, and I hope that this does, extend this conversation that's really important. Her wonderful book, Divine Rage: Malcolm X's Challenge to Christians. So we'll have to leave it there.